We are live. Welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. We are live with the renowned redcoat, Charlie the Brit. Come to talk some history, talk about the Wars of the Roses. Charlie, thank you for coming.
Hello, yeah, good to be here. So is there anywhere in particular you'd like to start with the Wars of the Roses?
Well, I think in my case, I know, of course, I didn't even know the pluralized Wars of the Roses. So that shows you, that's indicative of how much I know. I know there was, I saw the movie Black Arrow when I was a kid. So, I mean, I know very little about the Wars of the Roses. So a very kind of tell it to me like I'm 5 sort of a deal would be a good starting point. And then maybe I could ask questions.
Yeah.
And you can
I'll give the broad brush view. The background to the Wars of the Roses is the 100 Years' War, really. In 1415, Henry V had won the Battle of Agincourt and had made himself basically King of France because there was a long dynastic dispute going back 100 years, give or take, where Edward III had claimed the crown of France through his mother, which the French didn't think was a viable claim because it was through a woman and blah, 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 blah. They fought this conflagration with victories at Crécy, then defeats. And then Henry V had basically won it in 1415 with Agincourt, where he destroyed most of the French nobility. He'd controlled most of northern France. He'd secured a treaty with the King of France that when the King of France died, the throne would go to Henry's son. But he hadn't quite completely stamped out French resistance. The Dauphin, the French heir to the throne, survived and was gathering a lot of support in southern France. And Henry was slowly but surely besieging castles and getting his control secured. But before he could completely establish control, he died of probably something like dysentery. It's unclear exactly what he died of. It was something like that. And then later on, through a series of defeats as a result of him dying and his son inheriting his throne, his son wasn't old enough to properly enforce his own power over France. And then with some setbacks, like with Joan of Arc at Orleans and whatnot, the English were effectively defeated over a period. It got worse when their Burgundian allies defected, and effectively the 100 Years' War was lost. And Henry's son, Henry VI, he was far less effective than his father. He wasn't a good military leader. He wasn't an inspiring leader. And he was prone to what they might say was some bouts of madness. And so we get to the 1450s where Henry VI, being an somewhat ineffectual king, was pretty much almost like a puppet of his sort of counselors. These guys were basically they were working for their own initiative, and had basically, the state of England was that it was pretty. There was a lot of insecurity, and the king wasn't able to really ensure good governance. They'd lost loads of money in the 100 Years' War, and a lot of his earls and barons were quite upset with him. And so in this time, Richard, the Duke of York, this is in the 1450s, had a lot of political disputes with the king. He was of the Yorkist faction, which, although at this point there was no dynastic threat, no one was trying to challenge Henry's position on the throne. Richard, Duke of York, was very upset that the Earl of Somerset was basically in charge of England as Henry VI's prime counsellor. And the sort of start of the Wars of the Roses is as it really described, was the Battle of St. Albans in 1455. This was where Richard, Duke of York, having previously been made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, where he was effectively in exile, came to England and raised an army with 2 key allies of his. I'm just going to remind myself of their names. That was the Nevilles. That's the Duke of Salisbury and the Duke of Warwick. And they basically came to St. Albans with an army. And Henry VI was having Sorry, this is the dog. Henry VI was having a bit of a bout of madness at this time. He was sitting by himself in a church, and it was Somerset that was commanding the royal army. And the Duke of York came in and, without much difficulty, routed the royal army and effectively replaced Somerset in almost like a military coup as the sort of prime counsellor under Henry. And at this point, it was a case of nobles wanting to wrest power over political grievances. And this was just basically, it was a form of political action. It was like military force was part and parcel of politics at the time. Raising an army in that manner wouldn't be some kind of massive conflagration. It would just be the Duke of York's way of asserting his political power, because political power in those times effectively boiled down to how many friends you had and how many soldiers those friends could raise. And so that period really started the Wars of the Roses. And there was, because of the insecurity created by Henry VI's reign, where there was, whereas strong kings basically have military dominance, they have usually a good economic situation where they're not having to ask Parliament for lots of money, they're not having to tax their nobles, and basically the people that they're ruling over are happy with the current situation. And importantly, they're able to, through their authority, assure good governance and the rule of law. So disputes are settled amicably, criminality isn't rife, but that hadn't been the case with Henry VI. And so there was this bubbling up of discontent. And following the Battle of St. Albans, there was a lot of back and forth between this New Yorkist faction and the Royalist, at this point, Lancastrian faction. And throughout the next almost half century, there was a lot of back and forth. Eventually, at Wakefield, the Yorkists won out, and they wrested the throne from the Lancastrians. That was the Battle of Wakefield, I believe. And this went back and forth because, unfortunately, by this point, for the details I'll go into later, the wars had changed from a sort of political dispute to a dynastic threat, where the Yorkists openly claimed the throne and challenged Henry's legitimacy. And then once that had happened, there was almost no room for compromise. Whereas previously at confrontations like at Ludford Bridge, this was in 1459, so a couple of years after the previous one I mentioned at St. Albans. This was a case where the Yorkists had raised another army, and then the Royalist army responded to them. But at this point, whereas before they were happy to give battle, the Yorkists, because Henry VI was almost nowhere to be seen. At the confrontation at Ludford Bridge, Henry VI had sort of recovered his mental state and was seen to be waving the royal standard and sitting at the front of his army. And the Yorkist troops at this point didn't want to fight the king because they had political discontents, but they didn't want to start a rebellion, as many saw it. And especially when Henry made it clear that he'd give pardons to anyone that defected, the Yorkists basically packed up and went home, and the Duke of York retreated to Wales. But by the late 1460s, the Yorkists had made a very clear dynastic threat. They'd said, we want the throne. And so anytime they raised an army now, there was no room for negotiation. There was no sort of room for the Lancastrians to sit there and think, well, can we negotiate this battle? We could raise our army and come to the field, but we could come to an agreement. There was none of that, because as long as the Yorkists had an army, they were able to challenge the throne directly. And when the Yorkists did depose Henry and put Edward on the throne, they were very near to securing their power, but they hadn't, importantly, destroyed all the Lancastrian claimants. Several still existed, and Edward almost squandered to start with his success by allowing discontent to continue, where there were a lot of his allies who he had relied on to take the throne. When they started quarreling with other important lords who he now had to govern, he had to take the side of the people that had put him on the throne, and in doing so alienated the other lords, and so this discontent continued. Edward was then exiled or was forced to run into exile when Mary, who had been the wife of Henry, landed with a force, and Edward's military situation was just not tenable, so he ran away effectively. The Lancastrians wrested power again for a short time, but again, they hadn't got rid of any Yorkist claimants. And again, because they had started this dynastic challenge, there was no compromise as long as there was still someone trying to claim the throne. And this also meant that it made the security situation in England more complicated, because any Tom, Dick and Harry that had a political discontent with the current monarch could swing their banner to whichever dynastic challenger was currently on the throne. So when Edward was in power, if there was a local lord that had a problem with the king, whereas a century prior he'd have only had his own retainers to challenge the king's authority, now he could just run to the Lancastrian camp and fight his cause that way. And yeah, it went quite badly for a while. The Lancastrians weren't able to secure their position, and because there now existed this situation of violence being the norm, anytime one side won out, their situation was only as strong as their ability to militarily defend it, because that status quo had been effectively sent into thin air. But in the early 1480s, the Yorkists had a relatively strong position. However, this was undermined when Edward died and Richard III usurped the throne. This basically got rid of all his legitimacy, which people had been starting to accept for Edward, because there were very few Lancastrian claimants remaining. The only ones were like Jasper Tudor, I think, a half-blood who had a weaker claim to the throne. Edward had managed to sort of bring back the rule of law and security, but then Richard III completely undermined that. And that meant that when Henry Tudor landed in Wales, it was far easier for him to get support. And then eventually he defeated Richard and killed him at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, and thus ended the Wars of the Roses. And it really only ended because at this point, basically everyone who had a claim had been killed. And Henry VII was the only one with a strong claim to the throne. He married Elizabeth of York and then united the two houses. And basically at this point, everyone had enough. Henry proved competent enough in the ensuing years. He was a very shrewd financier. He secured the economic situation, didn't declare any unnecessary wars, and ultimately everyone just accepted it from there on.
Interesting. So from the start to the finish, what was it, 30-ish years?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, it was basically a series of, it was less a declared war and more a series of battles and campaigns that were used to force political motives.
Okay. And then the roses part, where does the roses come
So that comes from the symbols of the two key houses. The Lancastrians and the Yorkists were two different roses. You had the red Lancastrian rose and the white Yorkist rose. And then when Henry VII took power, he combined the two into the Tudor rose, which became rather famous.
Okay, interesting. So that was, it predated the wars and all that.
Yeah. They were the dynastic symbols for the two houses.
Okay, very interesting. And that, like the Princes in the Tower kind of a thing, that, how does that play in
So
they were claimants to the throne, right?
yeah, so Edward the Fourth, like I said before, he had basically secured his position. But when he died, his two heirs were young princes, and Richard III, as he later became Duke of York at this point, the king's brother, took power when these princes disappeared or died. It was never clear whether or not he murdered them. Some people claimed he did, but he was the next in line after they were out of the picture.
Yeah, it would have been very. He had a motive.
Yeah,
at least whether he did it or not. Interesting. Good deal. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, so it's a very interesting period because it's not the kind of civil war that we might envisage it today. It wasn't like the English Civil War of the 1600s or the US Civil War of the mid 19th century, because it wasn't that the Lancastrians woke up one day and thought, we want the throne. It was a escalating situation that over a period of time wasn't resolved. And then the Yorkists thought that the only way they could have their grievances resolved, and also by the point that they'd started fighting all these battles, they'd realized that they were sort of in too deep, and that claiming the throne was basically the only way to stop themselves being executed as traitors. So they went for it.
Interesting. And then the battles, and let's just say Bosworth Field.
Yeah.
What was sort of the latest advancements in weapons technology at that point? Yeah. What were they fighting with?
So they had rudimentary cannons at this point, though they weren't as effective as you see in, say, the 19th century. They were used and employed on the battlefield, but at this point in warfare, cannons were not accurate enough to do much more damage on anything other than castles. So they were, in fact, they did have a part to play on the battlefield. They weren't a deciding factor. What happened really at Bosworth Field was one of Richard's allies was basically unsure as to who was going to win. And so what he did was sit on the east flank of the battle and waited until it was kind of clear that one side was going to win out, which was Henry, and then proclaimed for him, although he'd previously been a sworn ally of Richard, but he came into the battle, joined Henry, and then Richard was defeated.
Wow. Typical politician, both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, that's literally it.
That's awesome. Well, good deal. Thank you. That is very informative, a great crash course. As far as books go, if someone says that's interesting, I want to read about it, what would be a good starting point to read a book or something like that?
Okay,
yeah, a good movie to watch. I don't know.
So I don't actually know of many good movies. There's, obviously the Henry V film gives a sort of background to the Wars of the Roses with the 100 Years' War, and sort of gives an insight into what warfare might have been like at the period in a very stylized way.
Yeah.
But in terms of more academic books, Richmond wrote a very good book called The Nobility and the Wars of the Roses. And Goodman wrote one just titled The Wars of the Roses. An interesting one that sort of talks a bit about the politics and Somerset in particular was by a chap called Jones, who in 1989 wrote a book called Somerset, York and the Wars of the Roses. That goes into the Duke of York and Somerset and their political discontents. There was sort of personal rivalry they had almost that sort of started the Battle of St. Albans.
Okay, good deal.
It's a very interesting period. Basically, by the end of it, half the English nobility had been killed. The population was incredibly war weary, and that's why Henry VII was so good, because he basically just sat back and focused on domestic affairs.
Okay. And I have not read it yet, but there's one I like. There's a historian that I like called Dan Jones that he wrote a book called The Wars of the Roses. I think. It's maybe 10 years old. It's not a really old book, but I've had
How do you
several
think-
friends read it and said they really like it.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, I don't know what you would think of it, but because I mean, he's definitely the type of the layman's historian. I mean,
Yeah.
he preaches to people like me, but that's what you need to get started a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
I mean, there's no point making history unaccessible.
yeah,
But it really frustrates me when you get a lot of books that are just completely unintelligible to anyone who hasn't read 100 pages of academia before.
yeah, and I definitely like I'm a simple man. I like simple books, at least until I know what questions to ask. So, good deal. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate
No
your
worries at
time.
all.
That was a very good overview.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Right now